Hi, I'm Dr. Stan Steindl. Welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt. Dr. Dennis Tirch is the founder of the Center for Compassion Focused Therapy in New York, USA. He's internationally renowned as a therapist, supervisor, trainer in CFT, and also cognitive behavioral therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy. He's the author of several books. My two favourites are The Compassionate Mind Guide to Overcoming Anxiety and Buddhist Psychology and Cognitive Behavioural Therapy, a Clinician's Guide, co-written with Laura Silberstein and Russell Coltz. Check out Dennis's website, mindfulcompassion.com, where there's more information as well as free resources such as meditations and blogs. I've known Dennis now for nearly a decade, and he's always wonderful to listen to and a font of wisdom. Check out his thoughts towards the end about the potential societal benefits of bringing compassion to the challenges of fear and anxiety. And so I bring you Dr. Dennis Tirch. Dr. Dennis Tirch, welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt.
Hello, thank you very much. I do technically have a T-shirt on underneath.
And
you are in the T-shirt. Yeah, it says Awoken Awareness, so we're gonna try to rep the T-shirt.
Absolutely perfect. I was just going to dive in with a few of the bigger questions, actually. So firstly, how would you define and differentiate the brain and the mind?
You know, the brain is, I suppose we all know this, but it's this sort of the term that we'll use to refer to the sort of like organ, the central organ of the nervous system, in humans and other mammals and other, there's a few other non-mammalians that have some sort of a brain. But even that distinction, while not entirely, it's not arbitrary, but the brain is a part of a larger network that's distributed throughout the body and is responding to sensory and electrochemical stimuli and physical stimuli outside of the body. So even though the brain is physical and seems like local, it's within and without the human being. It's a part of a network of interactions. But the brain would generally refer to that physicality. And the mind, it's interesting that what I'm tempted to say is that the mind is a term that points to the sort of corpus of cognitions, imaginings, like the way we describe mental events, private events, and sort of like the realm of experience within the individual. And it isn't so much a biological term or physical term as a conceptual term. However, a New York colleague of mine, Joseph Ledoux, the neuroscientist, who just recently mentioned that all mental events, in a way, are physical. All things are physical. So even when we use terms like mind or emotion, they're sort of nicknames for physical, embodied, local processes that relate to and undergird all of mental experience. So I think that's important, particularly with compassion focused work, because sometimes we talk about mind or three emotion systems or all these things. In contrast to the brain, people who are more behaviorally oriented can say, oh, well, you're talking about constructs. Like even emotion is a hypothetical construct. It's pointing to something, but it isn't instantiate. It's not physical. But I think once we recognize that all of those mentalistic constructs are sort of shorthand for something that proceeds from physicality, that frees us up to understand why understanding the evolution of the brain can relate so much to how we experience something as nebulous as the self, or our self experience, or our yearning for a lost love, that within the domain of like emotional quasi poetic expression, that has meaning, but it isn't completely untethered to the evolution of the brain itself. So it's a long answer, but that's how I tend to think about those terms in relation to one another.
Would you say you're a sort of a materialist, that it sort of all goes back to the physicality, to the local, to the sort of the bits of meat that we are walking around the world, or is there something beyond all of that?
It's I'm a non-dualist, so I think that we can use terms to divide up the one world and understand it that are useful. And in that sense, I'm a materialist because even the immaterial, when properly understood, will have a material essence. So even if we were to acknowledge things like multiple dimensions of existence, or the non-temporality and non-locality of quantum phenomenon, and interdependent origination, like the even things that seem implausible or impossible, like communication at a distance in time and space, all of those would be existing in a universe that we call material. So they would have material correlates. We just haven't described them yet.
Mm.
So I it's I'm not like a neurophysiological functionalist, or a logical positivist like Churchlands or other people like that, but I would say, in my own idiosyncratic understanding of what materialism means, like, sure, I'm a materialist.
Yeah. In a way, the mind kind of emerges from the brain in a sense, and it's almost a part of how we experience our brains. We experience our brains as these minds that feel things and think things and experience things in that more kind of personal way, but also interactional way, or relating to others kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, I think the brain is, an essential part of the experience of mind, for sure. I remember when I was a kid in the 70s, I'm just a little bit older than you, but we both grew up in roughly contemporaneous. There would be like this cereal that would be some crazy name, like sugar this or that, sugar smack, things you couldn't get. And it would have all this sugar and like the bright colors and some cartoon animal on the box. And then it would say, it's in the states it would be the US RDA, or like required diet. It is a part of this balanced breakfast. It's a part of the balanced breakfast. And then there'd be this little picture on the side of the cereal box where it would be like, eggs and fruit and toast and everything, and then a bowl of sugar cereal. And like, so it was a part of the balanced breakfast if you also eat another breakfast which actually has nutritional value. And like, so the brain isn't that ancillary a part of mind and cognition, but it is, even if it's the most essential part. I think it's what I love about what you're emphasizing, Stan, is it's still a part of it. And I see people make the mistake of going in one direction or the other. They either biologize all of the human experience, or they become like when sometimes in the ACT community there'll be radical behaviorists who will like rail against the idea of a brain, like being responsible. They're like, no, it's the embodied act of the entire organism in its context. And like the brain is involved. Well, so are your feet. And I'm like, well, maybe we're going a little far. So I think, like, dare I say, like a middle path is what I think we in compassion work we adhere to, like learning from brain science, learning from mind science, learning from common sense.
Hmm. Yes, that's where I guess my question comes from, is just noticing in CFT there's sort of reference in different ways at different times to both, in a sense. We have these tricky brains and we try to cultivate a compassionate mind, sort of thing. And it's interesting in CFT that the terms aren't used exactly interchangeably, but they're obviously very related to each other.
I think there's clinical utility in that, isn't there? Like, because people can understand it, and we're in a zeitgeist of where brain science is extremely important. And even like the three emotional systems model, it's a heuristic. It doesn't really exist. I mean, those emotions aren't brought forth without prefrontal cortex involvement, and they're not, Lisa Feldman Barrett, Joe Ledoux, other folks, even people who believe in basic emotions like Panksepp and all that, they've had to concede at this point that it's not like three specific, inviolate, completely discrete pathways like the plumbing that carries the hot water, or the plumbing that carries the cold water. It's a part of a very complex interacting system, and all of the behavioral expressions of threat or drive or soothing, they also interact. However, it is very useful to recognize that there can be distinctions drawn both functionally and to some extent physiologically in those three different systems. And even more importantly, people can grok it. They can grok it, and it can help them understand their personal history, their trauma history, and the value of compassion. So some of the things we say, including the triune brain, like the old brain, new brain, a lot of the brain science in CFT is not entirely correct in terms of the state of the art of neuroscience, but I don't think it has to be. I think it's more of an intuition pump, like Daniel Dennett would say, or like again, it's an awkward word, a heuristic device, which allows generative thinking and thought partnership.
Mm.
That's how
And
I
I
tend to look at it.
suppose, and I suppose it sort of to allow mind awareness as well, that notion of being able to notice one's own mind, to understand the brain, to see that all of this is perhaps not our fault, but that it is our responsibility. And that mind awareness bit is interesting as well. And I don't know whether it somehow crosses over to sort of concepts like consciousness. And I know that's a big area and a sort of a complicated one that we might not answer in our conversation today. But what is consciousness then, would you say, in the context of all of this?
I think like kind of like taking the smaller bite at that, like those questions first would be like, I love Paul's concept of mind awareness, and it's very similar to Dan Siegel's concept of mind sight. And I like it both to work with clients, and I like it when I'm training therapists, because there is an artificial distinction that can become a real distinction between psychoeducation and transformational clinical practice, and also from theory and practice. Theory at its best is deepening an understanding of a living process that is happening. So if we were together to listen to, Jimi Hendrix or John Coltrane and, or Django Reinhardt, we could talk about it in terms of the music theory. And we could either talk about that beautiful musical act in terms of music theory in a way that deepens our understanding, or we could reduce the idea. Like someone says, oh, you move the root up a half step, and then that's the flatted ninth, and that's why in that you might want to solo using a harmonic minor or a harmonic major, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no, my eye feels like somebody squirted lemon juice in my eyes. Like that's, now, like show me where the fingers went. What's happening? What's the rhythm? What's the feel? Let the theory be a window into an embodied experience. And I think when we're working with things like mindfulness, acceptance, awakening consciousness, compassion, devotional, non-dual love and bhav, like those are very deep and profound embodied human experiences. They're situated, and they're alive. And the theory of the psychotherapy or the case formulation, or even the psychoeducation is just transmitted to a client, can either be done with what like Sivananda called like dry lip Vedanta, like it's just the words, it's at the level of the head, and then you only have one legged of one leg of the three-legged stool of head, hands, and heart. So mind awareness to me is the head, hands, and heart coming into the clinical exchange in the dyad, so that it like enlivens that experience, and then people remember it. It's like sealed in more, and it is a consciousness to consciousness experience to get closer to the consciousness point. But like it's like a shared consciousness that then it's like what they say in Gurdjieff said, breathing the same air as someone, and then you leave with some of that exchange remains in your organization of your experience. I think that's what I like about mind awareness, and it does sort of approach that consciousness level.
Mm. It reminds me of the wonderful Maya Angelou quote, of course, that people don't remember what you say, or they don't even remember what you do. They remember how you made them feel, in a sense, and that's kind of what we're working with a little bit in CFT. Is there's stuff that we might say, and there's the psychoeducation and some of the metaphors we use, or the other heuristics and so on. But then there's the experiential work, which is more about helping them to feel it and experience it and embody something that they perhaps then take away and remember and bring into their life next time, I guess.
Yeah, and that's very well said. And that is where I think the magic happens in the
Mm.
psychotherapy dyad on the part of, you know, there's actually a triad, because there's the client, and then there's the therapist, and then there's the therapy, and and they interact with one another, and out of that, like three, something becomes possible that wasn't possible in the past, and it's really shared. And I think I see my role as being able to work on myself so that I can become more available to the psychotherapeutic act and to the transformational occurrence that comes from that alchemy of those three elements. And that means I, I have to be on an ongoing journey to get out of the way, get out of, like, and find the elements of my conditioned personality and suffering and over identification with tricky stuff, so that there can be more of a clear conduit, mutual conduit, bidirectional conduit, which allows transformation to happen. And we know what that is. We know that feeling, whether it's at Taylor Swift show, or within, in doing EMDR, or, in a moment when you hold your uh, child for the first time. I remember holding my brother's child. It was the first time, like, it wasn't more profound than my own daughter, but I'll never forget when my brother brought my goddaughter Lily home, and I was, it's like younger. I'm in my leather jacket, thinking I'm Mr. Cool and rock and roll guy, and but I'm going to be soft and sensitive and see my niece. And I remember holding her and looking at her, and just falling apart with a profound, loving, emotional, like, tearfulness, just like, because I couldn't even. It's like that embarrassing kind of, well, not embarrassing, but that I shouldn't be, too condemning, but there's that Jordan Peterson meme that goes around the video where he's like crying like crazy, and he's like, it's it's definitely happiness, but it's more than happiness. It's almost unbearable, and it's, it gets lampooned and stuff, and but he's talking about a real kind of thing, accessing like a transpersonal state of emotion, like and that's sort of like, it's not the
Mm.
only tool in our toolbox. It's not, but it's part of it,
Mm.
you know.
My father tells me that when he first held me, he felt like butter melting in a warm sun.
Ooh, that's so great. That's Wow, that's perfect.
I don't think he feels exactly that way with me these days, but that was certainly in those initial first hours. I just want to just check on something that you mentioned there, the client, the therapy, and sorry, the client, the therapist, and the therapy. When you mention the therapy there, is that the things that we're doing? Is that the therapeutic relationship as a third party? Or what do you sort of, could you just slightly more unpack that little piece?
Well, if you think about, we're going to go back to maybe too much. A lot of what it informs my work as a therapist, like, is a deep and lifelong study of the esoteric aspects of music and contemplative psychology and philosophy and music from like Sufi traditions and uh, Manouche and Sinti traditions and Western and liturgical music and the whole whatever it is, schmagegi, I don't know the word, but and and I think that you could, like, there's many disciplines that are embodied disciplines like martial arts or yoga or any, like, where there's or cooking even, that embodied disciplines that have been imbued with like esoteric philosophy over the years are really good correlates for what we do as therapists. So if we said, like, there's the music and the musician and the audience,
Ah,
you, it would be, we might be referring to, if you're playing Stravinsky, okay, that's the music. We might almost think we're talking about the music that are notes on the page, but there's something in the musical act that would not exist without, it's more than those two things. And I think the therapy is what I mean. It's like a correlate of that, like this, the therapeutic act that is occurring, that is interdependent on those three elements. And the more wholeheartedly and responsibly and I want to say meticulously, but also freely, the therapist and actually the client can engage in the therapeutic act, then the therapy is more refined and effective, I believe. And that includes having a rigorous case formulation, having a coherent therapeutic frame that is shared, mind awareness. There are specific skills, the evidence-based tools, but also the art and the science of that. And I think when you look at it through that frame, it makes more sense to me out of the common factors research, which sort of points to these elements of therapy that are hard to quantify. But if you think about them as being like emergent properties of the, like, rigor and wisdom and full commitment that the therapist and the client bring to that exchange, uh, it's augmentive, it's generative, you know.
yeah, that's really, really beautiful. I have often thought of the there's the sort of the therapist and the client, and the third party is the relationship, is sometimes how I've thought of it. But you've expanded really for me that third party and all the different components that sort of can be there. So, given all of this, what is suffering?
Suffering is a really interesting question, because a very popular thing for people to say is that suffering um, is pain minus acceptance or something, or people talk about clean pain and dirty pain, that pain is inevitable, it's a, and then suffering is sort of optional. And I get the wisdom in those statements. I don't want to, if you're a therapist who's listening, or somebody who's struggling and that's been helpful to you, I don't mean to, yuck your yum or puncture that or something like that's, because it's useful, but I think it can potentially be a little invalidating, in sort of suggesting that if you are suffering, you're somehow getting it wrong. And if you had the right attitude, you wouldn't be suffering, because you're right where you are. Every one of us is sort of like the it's not your fault paradigm. You didn't choose all of the countless causes and conditions in both our learning history or in our genetics or in the environment around us that have brought us to this exact moment. And in this moment, when you're experiencing suffering, I think, there's an experience, as it's described in the Buddha Dharma, that there is a like a very significant longing for things to be different than they are, when they cannot be different than they are, or an attempt to avoid something that is unavoidable, or a desire to have something that cannot be had. And I think that is accurate. I think what is pain? Like, pain is when an organism that it's experiencing itself as an individual organism has a signal that something is very, very wrong and needs to be addressed, or that organism is imperiled, and attention needs to go to the source of that pain. And I think, and it's aversive. It's something that, by almost axiomatically, like any individual organism wants to turn away from, wants it to stop. And I think suffering is something that involves, like, a thinking, feeling, kind of brings back to what is consciousness, in a way, like that some individual entity with some degree of sentience or consciousness is in the turmoil of an immediate urgency of the cessation of some kind of pain or distress or injury, or even an extreme longing that is unsatisfied. So I think suffering has many flavors and many colors, and the definition will probably expand, but that's how I tend to think about it.
Yeah. Yes, it's complicated, isn't it? I get what you mean, that if people are experiencing pain from completely outside of their control, or something has just kind of come upon them, and so on, and then we say that suffering is pain without acceptance, that has a bit of bite to it, in a way, doesn't it? It's almost saying, well, you should accept your pain or something like that, which isn't necessarily very easy or even possible. On the other hand, sometimes, yes, our brain is designed to focus on the pain because it's a signal of something, and but the same with pleasure, I guess. It's designed to focus on pleasure as well, and both pain and pleasure can sometimes, in their own different ways, be also sources of suffering. I mean, it's tricky.
Sure.
All of this is
Yeah.
tricky.
I mean, it kind of brings me back to what is consciousness. And there's a lot of, like, oh my God, there's the whole consciousness study society, and there's the local and non-local consciousness, and there's Chalmers and all these different philosophers, Dennett and blah, blah, blah. Like, one thing that I remember is that, again, in the Buddhist teachings and subsequent teachings, consciousness was actually not seen as particularly privileged. It was one of the five aggregates. It's one of the heaps, like sensation and thinking, that makes up a being. And I think we talk about, I don't think the term consciousness is sufficient for the order of awareness of being, and being in extension, that would be in a field of a conscious universe, like a tadpole consciousness might not even exist, and to the extent that it does exist, it's not it's not likely to be phenomenologically entirely similar to the consciousness of an organism with this kind of a brain, with more discrete neuronal combinations and permutations available than there are stars that are observable in any of the galaxies, all the galaxies in the world, or all the grains of sand on every beach. Like, so this particular organ of consciousness, that's like, not, like, as Alan Watts says, didn't come into the world but out from it, is a way that the physical universe has emerged. And I wouldn't say, I don't want to be teleological. It doesn't mean like it didn't emerge to observe itself, but it certainly is observing itself. Like, we are an aspect of this one world that is witnessing itself and experiencing itself with separateness, and even experiencing a self. And so I think, on one level, that the consciousness is that individuality, but on another level, there is no reason to presuppose that more sophisticated systems, like a solar system or a galaxy or a universe or different aspects of the multiverse, do not have their own form of consciousness and that we are a part of, and that in fact we may be experiencing as like a background hum, like the sound on Star Trek, or like when your air conditioner is running, or the sound grabber in the room. I don't really usually think of that until my attention goes to it, but I could train myself to attend to it. And if I can train myself to attend to whatever the super consciousness of interbeing would be, perhaps it's something that is already here. And perhaps when we train ourselves in compassion, we are experiencing a sensitivity to suffering of any being, including ourselves, and a inherent automatic desire to do something to alleviate that suffering, which that all of that is sort of in some ways a byproduct of experiencing all things as ourselves, directly experiencing that, not conceptually experiencing it. So, I recently, Paul and Choden and others were doing this talk about like two types of compassion. I talked about this with Paul for 15 years or so. Like, there's the compassion that like, well, may you be well, may you not have injuries, may you, when you die, your family's around you and you're 150 years old or whatever. Oh, a compassion for your depression. I want your depression to abate. Your compassion, I want your anxiety to cease. But then there's the sort of what contemplative traditions point to, which is that I want all of your suffering to cease, because I want you to remember who you are. I want you to remember who we are. And I want you to be able to not just remember it conceptually, but I want you to have the direct experience of yourself as intimately connected to, and in fact, indivisible from this living one world, and that's accessible to us, and it's incredibly transformational, and it's been written about forever. I mean, it's in the Vedas. You can, and particularly the Avatamsaka Sutra, the Huayan philosophy from Zen and Mahayana, talks about these different kind of stations of being, like individuality, mutuality, multiplicity, no thingness, oneness, and that we're sort of like a shapeshifter. We're like this diamond that's being turned in the light, and we could identify with the diamond, or we could identify with the light. Or as Watts again said, like, do you want to be the light bulb? Do you want to think of yourself as a light bulb, or do you want to think of yourself as a light? Or you want to think about like the field that is illuminated? And I think compassion, it can proceed from that. I mean, compassion can proceed from something very intimately individual, like your dad feeling like warm butter melting, and butter melting in the warm sun. I guess you're the warm sun of his, and then the other way to compassion is through our experience of oneness, or lack of separateness of our being. And that to me is a profound upwelling of love and connection that is related to personal compassion. But it isn't, I mean, in some ways it's the same thing, but in other ways it is phenomenologically distinct, and there are different pathways to compassion that way. It's just some thoughts based on the questions.
Yeah, no, I there's sort of a really revelation in there for me, that idea that suffering can lead to us forgetting who we all are in a way. And so compassion as a sensitivity to that suffering and an effort to kind of alleviate or prevent it is actually more than that. It's about aiding in our remembering who we all are, and the togetherness and connectedness and unity of all of that. It's kind of the great expanse, really, this notion of of consciousness. And I was going to, at the risk of getting sort of too reductionistic again, I suppose,
No,
but
not at
I
all.
guess another heuristic in CFT is sort of the idea of emotions, motivations, competencies, behaviors, and how we might try to differentiate some of that in order to then kind of reintegrate and transform some of that suffering. I wondered if you could just share some thoughts there in terms of those different components and differentiating some of that.
That's huge, and I've been really happy to see that emerge more uh, in the broader disseminated CFT practices and theory and community. It's been so exciting because it was a long time coming, and it goes. Well, you can trace some of those origins directly in Paul's work back to human nature and suffering, and depression, the evolution of powerlessness, and genes on the couch, and all like a lot of early writing, and of course the antecedents to that writing that Paul drew upon to develop the theory of motivation, emotion, competencies, and behaviors. I like that CFT is a process-based therapy as well as a skills-based therapy, and some therapies like ACT or relational psychoanalysis focus more on processes, and some forms of CBT or even DBT are more focused on skills, and some therapies are more top-down, like Gestalt therapy or EFT, where someone's going to have a holistic experience and then they're going to unpack it. And then some are more bottom up, where you're going to like, I'll go back to the ACT model again, where there's like, here's these 6 hexaflex processes where we're going to look at contacting the present moment, flexible perspective taking, diffusion, and 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 then you can train up. You can do a case formulation based on those elements, and then you can train them up. What I love about CFT is that it works on all those levels. It works relationally, it works on a process-based level, it works on a skills-based level, and that allows us to be the same kind of shapeshifter we were describing earlier. Like we can move, as they say. Our friend Francis Eason from France, he likes to say this little French term of dancing between the raindrops, meaning that somebody's kind of like, maybe getting things done by, the cleverness and slyness, and I think CFT allows us to kind of dance between the raindrops. And we think about motives in Paul's parlance and in CFT parlance, they are these core evolved imperatives that organize the evolution of our mind, and then organize the and brain, and organize the functioning of our mind and brain. So cooperation, competition, romantic attraction, sexual attraction, procreation, filial love, protection, evasion of danger. All of these things are core imperatives, and they always have these 2 parts. This one is the stimulus detection and discrimination, being able to notice the relevant thing in the environment that you need to respond to, and then the response repertoires, which is one of the reasons why CF, as we know, I'm going to old hat to most of our listeners or whatever. It's like you have your psychology of engagement and noticing, and those kind of perceptual sort of engagement skills and processes, and then you have how you're going to respond, and that opens up a lot when we then think about the model of emotion, being that emotions are not designed for us, they're designed by us, not by us, rather center reverse, not designed by us, but for us,
Yep.
through the process of evolution. And then also, like, they don't just give us feedback about our own personal preference, they are about how effectively we are realizing these motivations, these underlying motivational imperatives. So motivation allows us to better understand the data that is present in our emotions. It makes emotions seem less capricious, and it makes the understanding of the biological, like the level of functional analysis. Now, we have a couple of levels of functional analysis. We have the level of evolutionary functional analysis, and we have the level of personal functional analysis. And then in the therapy situation, we have the interpersonal functional analysis of in the room, here and now, what is this behavior that this client is exhibiting, and what is this intersubjective field? Like, how does it affect me? How does it affect them? How can we shape new desirable behaviors in the present moment? And that, in a way, I kind of skipped over the competencies, but that's to me like one of the most important areas. Is once we understand the motive, we understand how to work with the motives, and how, like, when we're operating based on like a threat based motive or a protection based motive or a competitive based motive, that's going to organize the brain and body and mind differently than a compassion based motive, a caring, giving, care receiving motive. We can use our emotions to track the data, and then we have to like really take stock of these competencies that proceed from a functioning mind when it's organized by caring or compassion. So our ability to tolerate distress or accept and tolerate distress, our ability to hold lightly and be non-judgmental about ourselves and and others, non-condemning, and also like to get out from under the influence of those condemning, categorical, evaluative thoughts, to be able to have flexible perspective taking and empathy and sympathy. And part of our case conceptualization model that we work with, as well as developmental history and emotional history and attachment history, is understanding which of those competencies people are willing and able to use in the flow of their lives, and then to actually formulate with the client like a curriculum of how to cultivate those competencies. And there's a byproduct of cultivating those competencies, which is a sneaky one, it's a little hidden, is that it can be a dojo, a forum for corrective attachment experiences. Like if we're sitting with a niece or nephew or one of our children, and we're like helping them build Legos or a puzzle, we're warm, we're steady. We might correct them if they get a little overly, frustrated or angry or distracted, but it's warm, and that is a forum where that young person, that child, can internalize the homeostatic attachment experience, so that they can experience emotional safeness and groundedness, and that prepares them to deal with threat and challenges in the future. It sets the neural tone. And similarly with clients, while we're working on skills training or cognitive reappraisal or diffusion exercises or imagery exercises, that the relational element of establishing the same experiential dimensions of compassion allows someone to entrain that homeostatic process or create a new working model by internalizing the therapist. And that to me is like really where the magic happens. We're really firing on all cylinders, where somebody's learning what they need to learn explicitly, and implicitly they're learning how to steady themselves and find their own awakening courage and compassion through the therapeutic act. That to me is spun gold.
Yeah, and it gives one shivers when it happens, doesn't it? Kind of you feel it when you can sense that you're in that flow. So there's these evolved motives that are kind of guided and energized by emotions, and there's certain competencies that we may have to bring to bear in to achieve, I guess, the motive in a sense, and then we take some sort of action, and there's a kind of a threat protection version of that, but there's also a compassionate version of that, perhaps, and that's where we're sort of trying to work, is to sort of explore the motives, the emotions, the competencies, and then ultimately taking helpful action in a sense with compassion. You're particularly well, I think you have very broad interests, but one thing that you're particularly interested in, I think, is just working with anxiety, and you've written several books, and I will have mentioned them right at the start, and also I'll have some links to those in the description notes as well. But one of them is the compassionate mind approach to anxiety, I guess, and so yeah, if we were to kind of focus in on how might all of this sort of help conceptualize anxiety from a CFT point of view?
I think, to me, one of the things that is most sad and also most encouraging in the world of CFT is that we haven't yet begun, in the main, to appreciate the direct effect of compassion training on the efficient regulation, tolerance, and transcendence of anxiety. Most people think about compassion, they tend to think about self-compassion, and they think about overcoming shame, because compassion is a wonderful antidote to shame. And it's also like where, working with shame is how Paul, and his clients as well as his colleagues, like, created this model, um, and we tend to think about trauma to some extent, because these traumatic experiences with caregivers that sometimes have blocked the cultivation of an internal soothing object. And yet, for me, very directly in the model is the ability to access the caregiving, care receiving motive and embodied compassion, which grounds and stabilizes excessive autonomic outflow, works very well to efficiently regulate without over controlling, threat-based processing, and genuinely affords us courage and psychological flexibility. So it is a direct pathway from compassion training to overcoming anxiety. It doesn't need the intermediary step of, oh, this will help you feel less shameful about your anxiety. That's a part of it. It's a part of what I've written about too. And I think that the world of anxiety treatment needs to better apprehend and appreciate the benefit of compassion training for overcoming anxiety. It will drastically accelerate, this is my prediction anyway, I live a bit ahead of the data, it'll drastically accelerate the effectiveness of ERP and other methods to overcome anxiety. And I think the CFT community can lead the way. And if we don't, someone else will, which will also be fine. It doesn't really matter. But it's where it'll go, I'm less certain that it will go there, given the ups and downs of sociopolitical factors and economic factors and military and ideological factors from all sides of the political spectrum. I used to be more certain that we were evolving, like we were working our way through what the Dharma and Vedanta and Sufism and Kabbalah and Esoteric Christianity and the therapeutic and these scenes, like with this, all the knowledge that was burned up in the Library of Alexandria, but that now is drastically accelerated through the scientific method. Like I was like, oh, this is going to be really cool. We're going to watch, people are going to gradually grok how compassion works directly on anxiety, and then we're going to move into awakening consciousness, which is why we wrote the book on Buddhist psychology and CBT, and they let us have chapter 10 being on enlightenment. And then all these folks are really into ego dissolving experiences with psychedelics. I thought, we're rocking and rolling. This is great. And I think we still are, but I think factors like, social media advancement and political polarization and algorithm driven divisions among people and the collective freak out to this century's pandemic, which tends to lead to world wars, that has now put a little a kind of a spanner in the works.
Yeah.
But that spanner is a part of the whole curriculum for the species. So, however long the species prevails, we'll get as close as we can.
It's a jagged path, I guess. It comes with its ups and downs. Ironically, the very thing that perhaps is causing the blip at the moment is kind of anxiety and threats and various things itself. In a way, that's the people are having their threat system activated, it seems, and some of those social mentalities around competition and seeing the very tribal nature of it. I see what you mean. It's sort of writ large at the moment, isn't it? The kind of divisiveness and so on.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I find really important kind of relates to like Rachman's work on fear. I think if we really wanted to step up as a field in psychotherapy treatment development, we would help people overcome fear, not
Yeah,
just. And I think what compassion work does that none of the other psychotherapies do, to me, as readily, is they invite people to experience fearlessness. Because as we know, anxiety is is a nickname for our threat systems, kind of our flight system or our evasion, or like getting away from dangers and threats that we have in our minds that are symbolic, that are representational. And that's the difference between fear and anxiety. Anxiety, it's not about how plausible it is, or I'm responding to an internal imaginal stimulus, and I'm having a threat response. That's my anxiety. Fear is something that is proximal or possible or likely, that there is actually danger present. And then you have a threat response. Now, fear is much more important in a way. It's much more rational. You feel anxious all day long. And whether or not you respond to your anxiety correctly, particularly in the developed world, or you air conditioning and food, you might have a worse afternoon. And like you might have a dreadful afternoon. Anxiety, I don't want to invalidate how hard experience anxiety can be. But if you don't respond properly to fear, you're injured or you die, or others die, or something bad happens, like in its most extreme expression. And when you look at people who are fearless, they are willing to face actual fear because something matters to them more than the possibility of danger. And another word that we use for matter, when something matters, is something that we care about. And care is a word that's essentially a metaphor, because care comes from our connection to each other. I care about Stan. I care about Cassidy. I care about Paul. I care. And I am designed to care. I am designed to preserve life, because life is more important than any one example of life. One organism, a species, is a specificity, a variation on the theme of how life expresses itself. And we are designed to preserve life. Life itself is very rare. Consciousness rarer still. A planet that can sustain life and consciousness and awakening consciousness and expansive consciousness is a very special thing. It's a very special thing in the universe, even at scale. And it's baked in to be able to do that. That's what we're able to do. And when you can access that aspect of mind and brain, you can walk right into the dangers. A famous story from Japan about a sort of like brigand, awful Ronin kind of a warlord going around and torching all the temples. And there's one famous, like wise, enlightened Zen master, and everyone's like, oh, he's going to come and they're going to kill that guy and burn down his temple. Wow, that's serious, some serious stuff, and it's tragedy. And the warlord shows up at the gates to this, and the monk is there, and he's standing there, not let him through. And the warlord says, do you have any idea who I am? I could take this sword and run it right through your heart without blinking an eye. And the Zen teacher says, you don't know who I am. You could run that sword right through my heart without me blinking an eye. And you're not coming in here. And supposedly the warlord's like, I'm your student. Don't burn the temple down. This is our new capital. This is where we're settling. I need to know what that was, what that was. And that, if you can get there with a client, it might be like using a fire hose as a water fountain sometimes if somebody's like worried about like whether their boss is angry at them. But that capacity is in every single client and in every single therapist and in every single clinical exchange. So when we can bring that forward, ERP gets more palatable. You'll have less dropout rate. You have to know how to administer that. You have to know to like bring that forward together. It makes like really difficult and scary and challenging clinical exchanges much less so, because they're not really about that one individual dance. It's about together we're going to make this happen. And like every move, that every resistance, everything, like you're an expert in MI as well as CFT and CBT and all these things, and you've written your own books and you're a master clinician. You train wonderful people all over the world, and I've seen you role play and see your work. It's masterful. So you can bring that in. You can evoke that, and on our best days, it's obviously we can't do it every time. Like I'm sure Andre Segovia had a bad night. Insert name of athlete here in the U.S. with Michael Jordan. He didn't shoot every shot. Everybody's and when I use those like lionizing examples, I don't mean them just about Stan Steindl or Dennis Tirch or Paul Gilbert or Kristen Neff or Deborah Lee or Laura Silverstein, or I'll go down the list of people who like do compassion work that some people know about. It's every single one of us. Every single one of us has access to that. Has access to the Avalokiteshvara, like the archetype, the Bodhisattva, the one who hears the cries of the world. It's a part of all of us. And when we allow ourselves to be available to it, things happen.
And wouldn't that be amazing? That is the task ahead, really. And it makes me think of the importance of anxiety and working with anxiety and people having that kind of awakening to the sort of these approaches to anxiety and to strength and courage and so on, but especially for men and boys, which is an area that I'm particularly interested in at the moment. And it seems that if men can, sort of find ways to kind of manage those very automatic and default, motivational systems and the anxiety that arises, that there might be a whole lot of things that can be different. And the warlord, of course, was arriving at the Zen temple full of threat system activation, anxiety, anger, desire to hold and control, and so on. But if I suppose, I think if men can have ways to manage that piece, that could mean wonderful things for society and the world.
And in order for that to happen, that piece has to be valued, which is a very strange thing to say, because we've reached a time, perhaps not during like wars or crime or something, but like the predominant like media portrayals of men and maleness right now have taken for granted the evolutionary role that males of like primate species hold, which is not always a pretty role, and it has some very difficult parts of it, because they were sort of protectors and providers and faced literal danger, both in hunting and also in the kind of protection from other dangerous beings, including other males, right? Because that's the way the life is organized, and we've reached a technological space where a lot of the necessity of those more aggressive dimensions of male primate behavior in this sophisticated primate that we are, like the benefit in maleness and masculinity isn't always apparent. So and masculinity has been transferred to women and non-binary people. So in the popular culture, so the action heroes are women and leaders are women and knights are women and Jedi are women and superhero women, which in one level is a beautiful thing because it allows for inclusivity, it allows for empowerment, it allows for it's appropriate to the age, it's appropriate to the technological time, it's appropriate to the evolution of the species, and I don't think it should change. But unfortunately, it does sometimes leave people thinking that all men is toxicity. All men have contributed, has been aggression or dominance or imperialism or violence. And that contributes to a global crisis in men's mental health. It's in the US, it's one of the reasons why gender inequality in higher education is greater than it has been since 1973, but in the opposite direction, where there's a ratio of women to men in higher education, let alone graduate school, or let alone succeeding, is more unequal now than it was men to women, 50 years ago, or whatever it is. Now, I say those things fully aware that they'll be triggering for some folks, and it's going to sound like I'm that bloody Jordan Peterson or some bad idea that, men's rights. And that's really not at all what I mean. What I mean is that, when we get out of threat-based processing and fight or flight processing, we can hold difficult paradoxes and opposites together, and we can think about collaboration coming together and actual compassion, where we do want to culturally, socially, at scale, disincentivize and extinguish toxic masculinity and violence and sexism and all of those things, predatory objectification of women, and that in order to do that, we can still hold in respect and kindness and admiration men and women and people of all genders who have suffered greatly over many, many, many generations to bring us where we are here. And if we're in a caring and sharing and cooperative, collaborative mode, we can eschew violence. We can eschew violence without condemning all men as being violent. We can eschew being harmful without saying that's the bad guy and that's the good guy, or that's the gendered term really, but because it's not our fault. That's the core wisdom of the wisdom of blamelessness, is that life was going to proceed exactly as it was going to proceed on this planet. And it's reached these critical junctures where, forget artificial intelligence, we need actual intelligence. We need the intelligence to realize what we are actually capable of. We have more than enough food. We have more than enough resources. We do not have adequate systems to understand how to cooperate at all. And it's not just because of the bad capitalists, because there are no discernible answers, as far as I can see, anywhere yet in terms of political or economic systems for maintaining flourishing. I think psychological science, I think the science of compassion, I think wisdom traditions, the proceeding from loving awareness and a sense of mutual responsibility of one another and oneness, that's the state of mind and the embodied motive that will allow us to solve the issues that we face, whether it's in the consultation room or overcoming an addiction, or whether it's war or economic inequality. When we go back to fighting one another and demonizing one another, the genie's left the bottle, man. Like it's like the old joke, like you ask for directions up in the mountains and somebody says you can't get there from here. Like you just, that's not how it's going to work. And like part of forget, it's like the flow of life exercise, that we use in the deeper CFT kind of personal practice, whereas he's like, we've forgotten who we are. It's a different use of forgotten who we are. It's not just that self-remembering and mindfulness, but it's like, look at what we keep doing to each other. We're doing it now worse than when we were doing those exercises in 2016 or something like that, or 2014. And it's all, when I talk to people about things, even in a marriage, it's like a marriage when people talk about politics or interest in or within the multiple selves. It's like, yeah, there's too much polarization. Do you see the way they polarize? There's too much conflict. Do you see the way they fight? You see how bad they are? Rather than recognizing that, like diarrhea or like breathing, this is what we do. We freak out, we act crazy, we hurt each other, we fall down. But we also help each other and we get up and we help each other get up and we tend to each other's wounds, and like we teach each other and we teach other generations. And I think that's the good that we can do in this compassion science community and compassion psychology communities, bring us back to that and teaching that and disseminating. If you do that, the rest will take care of itself. The rest takes care of itself.
Well, very thought-provoking conversation, Dennis. Many, many things will continue to rattle around in my brain, I think, just thinking through some of the ideas. It feels a little bit like we have a heck of a 5 months ahead of us, I guess, on some of those fronts that you were just discussing. But the possibility of ongoing evolution, I still believe it. I still believe it. If people are interested in your work or in being in touch or whatever, where can they find you?
Mindfulcompassion.com is the best place to go to kind of connect. You can contact us through the email there, through the phone there, and there's like a whole page of meditations, and our team there does some great blogs, and we're just kind of beginning to roll out more connection to the larger communities that we interact with. And that's also will be the home of the Compassionate Mind Foundation USA, which is just sort of like was reborn recently with our first event. And we're a nonprofit now in the US and have the continuing education credits for US psychologists and such that we can provide. And so there's watch this space. There's more to come, and we love working and collaborating with people. So it's really just love to hear from you and to help support your work, whoever you are. And if you're somebody who's listening to this who's like looking for help or therapy, also get in touch with us. And if you're not in the New York area, or if you're not, like, we can't help you directly, we can certainly connect you to wonderful people like Stan and others all over the world, and we're all in this together.
Great. And you do have an amazing Twitter or X thing that you post, beautiful and very well motivating. Kind of, it's often about, I guess, anxiety and strength and courage and how to cope with life's difficulties and so on. So I encourage everyone to follow Dennis there. But yeah, Dr. Dennis Tirch, thank you very much for speaking with me on Compassion in a T-shirt.
Oh, thanks so much. It's a real honor. So thank you so much, Stan. Dr.
Thank
Stan
you.
Steindl.
Thank you.